In this video, we'll be going over the best cards for you that also happen to allow your opponent to draw cards, and not cards which allow your opponent to draw the most amount of cards, which could be a topic for another video. And at number 10, we have Dark World Dealings. This card is pretty simple and straightforward in its usefulness. Each player draws one card, and then each player discards one card. It's a -1 in card advantage for the person who uses it, but sometimes it's pretty useful because it allows you to dig through your deck and set up your graveyard. Forcing your opponent to do the discard as well is most of the times a benefit to them because of how prevalent graveyard effects are, which is why this card has kind of stopped seeing play in the modern meta. It used to be one of the best cards in Dark World decks because it basically just allowed you to activate the Dark World effects of any Dark World card in your hand. And the fact that it affected your opponent as well was supposed to be just a downside of it. That wasn't really a downside because it wasn't that big of a deal. So if you use this with something like Bro, Huntsman of Dark World, it allows you to draw a card when it's discarded by a card effect. It basically becomes hand neutral with that specific Dark World monster. And so if people would play Dark World Dealings outside of Dark World decks, it wasn't too surprising to see them also play a couple copies of Bro, Huntsman of Dark World to complement it. And while it mainly only saw play in Dark World decks, it was occasionally included in FTK decks for its pretty generic potential to allow you to get through your deck faster, even if it's an inherent -1. Although there are better cards that can accomplish the same thing, which I'll go over at a little higher spots on this list. And at number 9, we have Recall. This is a counter trap card which has the effect that if your opponent activates a monster card effect, your opponent draws one card and also you get to negate and destroy that monster. So it's a conditional monster negate that also gets rid of the card, and the downside to this wonderful effect is giving your opponent a card afterwards. Now, the effect of this card is actually really good, and it being a counter trap card makes it hard for your opponent to respond to it. However, it came out a little bit too late to see any competitive play. 1 year before Recall came out in 2016, a different counter trap card called Solemn Strike was released, which allows you to basically do the same thing as Recall, except with the cost of just paying 1500 life points. And it has the option to negate a special summon as well. And Solemn Strike is kind of ridiculously good. 1500 life points isn't even that much to pay, and it covers two really useful bases. That Recall in comparison is kind of lackluster. However, it is still technically a good effect. If you want to play a deck that has a whole bunch of cards and negate your opponent's monster effects after you play 3 copies of Solemn Strike, and you don't want to have to discard your own cards in order to negate monster effects with things like Ultimate Providence or Divine Wrath, then Recall is an excellent second choice to include, since it's basically always a live target, since the downside is just giving your opponent more advantage, rather than requiring you to have to use cards in your hand to discard. Which is a distinction that could come up and be pretty useful, which is why some of the other cards in this list see play despite basically having that same drawback. And at number 8, we have Grand Horn of Heaven. This is another counter trap card which allows your opponent to draw a card as part of its downside, where if your opponent would special summon a monster during their main phase, you get to negate the summon and destroy the card, then end the phase immediately, while also giving your opponent a draw of that one card. Now, Grand Horn of Heaven did see competitive play, even though the 4 Solemn cards all have effects which allow you to negate summons as well, and only require you to pay life points to use them. However, Grand Horn of Heaven ends the main phase, so it stops all of the combos instead of just one, and your opponent is forced to continue their combos in their main phase too, which can actually be super beneficial against a lot of decks. However, it is a lot easier to just run the Solemn Brigade, as usually you can interrupt your opponent's turn by just negating a single summon, but Grand Horn of Heaven is an excellent alternative, or something to just be played alongside them if you really want a whole bunch of counter trap cards that stop your opponent from summoning. And the effect is so good that your opponent drawing a card afterwards isn't that big of a deal. And at number 7, we have Kuraz, the Light Monarch. This card has the effect that when it's normal or special summoned, you get to target up to 2 cards in the field and then destroy them. Then, depending on who controlled the cards that were destroyed, the owner of those cards gets to draw 1 card each. So, if you use this to destroy 2 of your opponent's cards, then your opponent gets to draw 2 cards, which is a pretty heavy downside to a Monarch effect, where basically all the other Monarchs don't have downsides to their summoning conditions, and they're just pure removal if you successfully tribute summon them. But Kuraz the Light Monarch is different. It was part of a weird phase of Monarchs, alongside Delg the Dark Monarch, where they tried something new with Monarchs, where they gained their effects no matter how they were summoned, instead of only through a tribute summon. But their effects have downsides as well as preventing them from attacking the turn they're summoned. Whereas all other Monarchs don't have downsides for their effects and can attack the turn they're summoned. And since it didn't work out very much, they immediately abandoned this idea, and all new monarchs after those ones kept the old style of just gaining an effect when they were tribute summoned. However, one of the much newer monarchs has an ability to special summon a monarch from the deck, which can be used during your opponent's turn if you use its second effect to tribute summon it during your opponent's main phase. And since there's only 2 monarchs that have effects that can be activated when they're special summoned, Kuraz the Light Monarch is the obvious choice to be brought out from the deck during your opponent's turn, in order to disrupt plays or just destroy key cards during your turn. If you're able to interrupt a combo, it doesn't really matter if your opponent gets to draw 2 cards or not. And it can also just be used to destroy your own Monarch Spell or Trap cards because a lot of them have really good graveyard effects, as it could be like a harder to use Magician Souls. So nothing but pure advantage when used with Ether, the Heavenly Monarch, although it didn't see any play at all before that card was released. And at number 6, we have Drag Down into the Grave. This card has the effect where it forces both players to reveal their hands to each other. Then both players get to discard 1 card of their choice from their opponent's hand to the graveyard. Afterwards, both players get to draw 1 card. So it's kind of like Dark World Dealings with extra steps, except it's also much better than Dark World Dealings for a whole bunch of different reasons in specific decks. You see, in Dark World decks, funny enough, this discard effect counts as an effect, so it activates all the Dark World effects. So if you simply have only Dark World monsters in your hand when you use this, it doesn't matter which card your opponent chooses because you'll activate that effect when they discard it, while also being able to look at your opponent's hand and get rid of any problem cards, like a hand trap or a really good starting piece. And that second use of the card is why it saw play outside of Dark World decks as well. Drag Down to the Grave is basically an easy way to just look at your opponent's hand, that way you know what to play around if you're playing a really good combo deck. Sure, your opponent gets to look at your hand as well, but if you just only have 1 card in your hand that you don't care that goes to the graveyard, then it doesn't really matter, and you gain full advantage of your opponent's hand while being able to interact with it. Although your opponent does also draw a card afterwards, so they will have 1 card unaccounted for, but for the most part, if you're playing through 4 cards that you know, there's a high chance you'll be able to play around whatever they have, and that information is kind of crucial in high levels of play, where playing around your opponent's hand traps is crucial for the success of certain decks. And this one is one of the easiest non-trap card ways to do this, which is why it occasionally sees competitive play over the years even outside of Dark World decks. And at number 5, we have Morphing Jar. This is a flip effect monster with an effect so good that it was just straight up banned for years, and is still limited on the ban list even when flip effect monsters are thought of as a joke outside of Subterror decks. Because what it does is when this card is flip summoned, both players discard their whole hands, then draw 5 cards. And the really important distinction about this card is that you're not drawing an amount of cards equal to what you discarded, but you're straight up drawing 5 new cards. So if you have no cards in your hand when this effect goes off, then it's a +5 in card advantage, which is insane. That is so many cards to draw from one effect, and that effect is so good that Morphing Jar still sees competitive play, even though it's a slow flip monster, which are usually destroyed before they ever get a chance to flip up. It's really hard to cheat the activation of flip effects without really messing up the synergy of your deck, yet people still go out of their way to do it anyway, because Morphing Jar is just worth it. And also, the discard effect is counted as an effect, so Dangers and Dark Worlds and Fables all gain their effects if discarded through Morphing Jar, so it's even more advantage in those kinds of decks, as it basically allows you to activate the effects of all the monsters in your hand, while replacing your hand with a very respectable amount of 5 cards every time. And since this affects both players, it's somewhat balanced in a way, where your opponent will also draw a whole bunch of cards if they have a really small hand. Although this distinction means Morphing Jar can be used to mill your opponent as well, by just having a deck full of nothing but cards that allow you to flip a card up and down, in order to have Morphing Jar use its effect about 8 times. And since Morphing Jar constantly refills your hand if you're trying to mill in this way, it makes it really easy to keep drawing new cards in order to flip it up and down, which created a legit meta deck called Empty Jar. It wasn't a super popular meta deck, but it was one that existed, which allowed you to mill your opponent with Morphing Jar, although this card was mostly used for just the excellent effect of just drawing 5 cards. Although, not in every deck. Morphing Jar is a really good example of how weak flip monsters are, where we have something as powerful as Morphing Jar in the game, and it's only a niche option in some decks, and not an auto-include in all of them. And at number 4, we have Trickstar Reincarnation. This is a trap card which has the effect where you banish your opponent's entire hand. Then your opponent draws a number of cards equal to the amount of cards you banished. and then also has a graveyard effect in order to special summon a Trickstar monster from your graveyard. And this card could be searched out in Trickstar decks pretty easily, so it saw competitive play in pretty much any deck that used a Trickstar engine, which was a lot of them when they came out. And the reason Trickstar Reincarnation saw so much play was because both of its effects were actually good. Trickstar Reincarnation isn't the first card in the game that allows you to reset your opponent's hand. There's also cards like Disturbance Strategy, which basically does the same thing, except banishing those cards instead of returning them to the deck means there's a chance you can get rid of one-off combo pieces that your opponent doesn't have other copies of. And also, because you could use Trickstar Reincarnation in order to get rid of all of the cards in your opponent's hand permanently. You see, there's this hand trap called Draw and Lockbird, which has the effect to stop your opponent from adding cards from their main deck to their hand for the rest of the turn, but can only be used after your opponent has already done it at least once outside of the draw phase. So, the obvious interaction with Trickstar Reincarnation would be to just use Draw and Lockbird to make it so your opponent can't add cards from their deck to their hand, and then just use Trickstar Reincarnation afterwards in order to get rid of all the cards in their hand and they wouldn't be able to draw them back. Although, there's a ruling in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you can't activate a card if its effect can't resolve. So, you can't do that. Unless you activate Trickstar Reincarnation first, then chain Draw and Lockbird after the Trickstar Reincarnation. Because you see, Draw and Lockbird has a neat distinction with its requirement for the activation, where it can be done after the trigger has been met, but it doesn't need to happen immediately. And because there's a little bit of a window of opportunity, you can activate Trickstar Reincarnation as a Chain Link 1 immediately after your opponent triggers the condition for Draw and Lockbird, and then chain Draw and Lockbird to it as a Chain Link 2, since the window of opportunity is still open, and then simply resolve the chain backwards like normal. Draw and Lockbird would go off and make it so your opponent can't add cards from their hand to their deck anymore, and then Trickstar Reincarnation will go off, banish your opponent's entire hand, but not let them draw any cards. And since this combo was incredibly easy to pull off, you basically just needed to have 2 cards in your hand and wait for your opponent to perform any search. Then Trickstar decks could just instantly win if they lucked into the draw to Draw and Lockbird, because they could easily search out Trickstar Reincarnation. It's really hard to come back from just losing your entire hand. That's why we have cards like Topologic Gumblar Dragon banned. Although Trickstar decks haven't really seen any play in the last couple of years, so this combo isn't really around as often. And the top 3 cards still see competitive play even today. And at number 3, we have Dark Bribe. This is a counter trap card similar to Recall, where you can activate in response to an opponent's spell or trap card in order to negate and destroy that card, but then allow your opponent to draw 1 card. Now, normally, being able to negate monster effects is kind of more useful than negating spell or trap cards, except in a couple of specific circumstances that actually come up in some pretty relevant meta decks. Namely, Mystic Mine decks. Mystic Mine is a very strong field spell card that shuts down all monster effects and can win you games on its own if you just don't have a spell or trap card to out Mystic Mine. So what most players will do in order to get rid of Mystic Mine is to side in something like Twin Twisters or Lightning Storm to destroy their entire back row. And in those cases, the only thing you have to worry about is spell or trap card destruction. And you know your opponent doesn't have very many of them in their deck, so Dark Bribe is just an easy negate to those answers. It's the ultimate complement of Mystic Mine decks, and it's sometimes played alongside Solemn Judgment, which usually does a good enough job of stopping those cards itself, but just adds more consistency. And there's a lot fewer counter trap cards that can stop both spells and traps than there are counter traps which can stop monster effects, especially ones which are pretty unconditional and don't require you to spend your own resources to perform those negates, and instead just give your opponent more resources. Although outside Mystic Mine decks, Dark Bribe is also just a decent side deck option as well, because if you're playing a deck that's really afraid of particularly strong spell or trap cards, like maybe Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplet, then Dark Bribe can shut down those singular powerful cards and save monster effects. Although, so can Solemn Judgment, which is why Dark Bribe is usually only played if they just need extra protection past the 3 copies of Solemn Judgment. And at number 2, we have Book of Eclipse. This is a quick play spell card which changes all face-up monsters in the field to face-down defense position. Then, during the end phase, it changes them all face-up. And afterwards, your opponent gets to draw a number of cards equal to the number of cards that were flipped face-up by this effect. So it has a pretty obvious downside there. It's giving your opponent a whole bunch of draws of cards if those monsters exist on the field during the end phase after they've been flipped down with the effect. However, Book of Eclipse still sees competitive play because its effect has a whole bunch of upsides to where it's kind of worth the risk of giving your opponent a bunch of draws. For one, if you're going second and your opponent has a full board of scary monsters, you can just flip them all face down and not have to worry about their effects, kind of like Dark Ruler No More. Although your opponent can respond to your Book of Eclipse, and it doesn't work on Link monsters. Alternatively, it can be used during your opponent's turn in order to interrupt plays, since face-down monsters can't be used as materials for extra deck monsters besides fusions, because fusions are an exception to that rule for some reason. Although if you do use it during your opponent's turn, there's a good chance they'll be put to face up and then they'll get to draw cards afterwards. It's an emergency thing you can do, as well as being able to flip all of your opponent's cards during the battle phase in order to stop a battle phase from happening. Book of Eclipse can also be used defensively in the same way as Book of Moon, where if you're trying to resolve the effect of a monster and your opponent activates a negate, you can chain Book of Eclipse in order to flip all the cards face down, which will allow your effect to go off, since most monster negates don't work on face down monsters, but being flipped face down doesn't prevent the monster's effect from resolving. And the last benefit of Book of Eclipse is the fact that it does not target. That's why Book of Eclipse might be used over something like Book of Moon, which doesn't have the downsides but still has all of the benefits. Non-targeting flipping of all cards face down is really useful because of all the situations I just listed, and having the option to use it during either player's turn is why this card sees play sometimes over other more powerful staple spells and traps, like maybe Dark Ruler No More or even Forbidden Droplet. It has more versatility than Dark Ruler No More, and doesn't require you to lose as much advantage as Forbidden Droplet. But the reason it doesn't see more play than those strong staples is because of that pretty gnarly downside, and the fact that it's not spell speed 4 like those two. It's pretty easy to negate Book of Eclipse, whereas it's not easy to negate Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplet, but not impossible. So Book of Eclipse definitely sees play, but not a lot, and nowhere near as much as Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplet. And at number 1, we have Card Destruction. This card simply has the effect where both players discard all the cards in their hand, then draw an amount of cards equal to the amount that they discarded. So it's kind of like Morphing Jar, except you can use it immediately as soon as you draw it, and it's technically a -1 in card advantage, instead of a potential +5 like Morphing Jar. But Card Destruction sees infinitely more play than Morphing Jar because it's just easier to use, and kind of accomplishes the same thing of ditching your entire hand to the graveyard while being able to draw new ones to replace them. And it even discards as an effect, just like Morphing Jar, so it's an instant activation of discard-like effects, like Dark Worlds or Dangers. The fact that it affects both players is kind of a detriment in most cases though, because you don't really want to discard your opponent's hand as well, because of how prevalent a lot of graveyard effects are. However, being able to ditch your entire hand in order to get new ones is still super good, which is why Card Destruction definitely still sees competitive play anyway, way more than all the other cards on this list, and why this card is still limited to 1 copy, and also why the card was actually banned for a few years. Alright, and that's the list. Hopefully you guys like these weird topics. They're honestly my favorite kinds of topics to work on.